粵語郭文貴65。呢一次我哋講到美國國務卿7月23號喺尼克遜圖書館嘅演講所引申嘅話題。呢一輯好似成個鐘頭咁長，其實後面嗰一半係個附錄嚟嘅。如果你已經聽過龐貝奧嘅演講，或者興趣唔係太大，咁你就可以慳翻呢個目錄最尾嗰項㗎啦。而前面嘅7項夾埋都係半小時左右嘅啫。一開始就係郭文貴同我分別總體評論，跟住嗰3項犀利啦，係反映美國朝野兩黨喺佢哋為咗下一屆邊個做總統打生打死嘅時候，對於親中滅共嘅新國策竟然係高度共識喎。佢哋互相遞共之餘，邊個想親中冷淡啲、滅共勢力啲，都會冇運行，因為選民會唾棄佢哋。所以話中國共產黨仲以為可以將希望寄託喺特朗普敗選、民主黨上台之上，真係唔使旨意啊！尾二嘅小項目就係我稍為提一提上個禮拜曇花一現嘅一場爭吵。好啦，進入戲肉。第一、2項，郭文貴指出呢次演講係反映美國徹底否定咗50年來對中共綏靖嘅政策，改為滅共親中。而我嘅分析就係，美國似乎接納咗或者不約而同地發展出郭文貴主張咗3年嘅路線，由大至細3個層次：親中、以美滅共、以共滅共。而家去片。
作為一個軍人出身，西點軍校第1名啊，美國 CIA 情報局局長，現在的美國的對外外交大臣國務卿龐比奧發表了重要的演講。這個演講的重大意義在哪裡？大家要看到，徹底結束了基辛格對共產黨，讓共產黨強大中國具有法治民主自由中國人不配擁有民主，中國人太低教育，要讓共產黨強大，再給共產黨幾十年這再給幾十年已經說了70年100年了。不但如此，龐比奧還發表了第2個觀點，要和中國人一起要更換督促和中國人在一起，要讓中國共產黨的這個 regime 把它徹底給推翻。這是美國官方有史以來正式的第1次美國官方官員提出要把共產黨定義為一個流氓機構。流氓機構能合法嗎？流氓機構當然不合法，那怎麼辦？和中國人一起把它推翻。第3個非常重要的，他把中國人和中國共產黨徹底分開。中國人跟中國共產黨完全不一樣，中國人是一個最大的受害者。不但中國人是最大的受害者，而且還很關鍵地提出來，最後的最感動人的是上天保佑中國，上天保佑美國人。
跟住係我講，大概冇乜其他人講過嘅綜合評論。美國嘅親中當然係改變咗對象，以前當執政黨代表國家同人民，主要就係親執政黨，而家親中就真係親中國同埋中國人民啦。剛才郭文貴點評嘅時候，左上角嘅字幕已經可見一斑。所以呢一點我無需多講，大家就繼續喺左上角睇下親中呢個字樣就知道我引述嘅所有發言人嘅親中觀點啦。呢個觀點就係郭文貴主張咗2-3年嘅美國新政策同郭文貴一致嘅，當然仲有滅共啦。但係請注意，連滅共嘅方法都一致喎。嗰個相似嘅程度由大到小就係以美滅共同以共滅共。以美滅共就係以美國為首嘅國際正義力量去滅共，以共滅共就係調動中國共產黨99.99% 嘅黨員，佢哋嘅積極性去針對頂層嘅10幾20個權貴家族，即係盜國賊集團。欲知詳情就請去影片框之下睇注1。美國都開始講啲以共滅共，可見於 Bill Goods 點評龐貝奧演講嘅呢一句。
Another key point factor he talked about there was he said the current Chinese leadership does not speak with one voice. That was a clear recognition that there are fissures within the ruling Communist Party of China.
Bill Good 所講嘅其實係龐貝奧呢一句。
The Chinese Communist Party, it's a cadre of rulers that are far from homogeneous.
而美國嘅一份大報紙講龐貝奧演講嘅社評最尾嘅結論嗰段最尾嗰句都有同樣嘅觀察喎。佢話美國對北京更強硬嘅政策可以說服北京嘅其他人。阿習先生嘅路線如果係持續落去，將會係太昂貴啦。咁啊，即係撩其他共產黨員，你哋負唔起呢啲代價㗎啦，快啲擁冧佢啦。咁啊，即係以共滅共咯。美國制裁中共黨員喺海外嘅親屬同埋資產，亦會起到一啲策反中共黨員嘅作用。所以以共滅共嘅政策會唔會越嚟越好似親中以美滅共咁顯著呢？的確係值得我哋注意、深思，甚至考慮配合嘅。好啦，跟住嗰7分鐘就係聽下班農嗰個電視台喺龐貝奧演講之後請阿 Bill Goods 嚟總體點評一下。
Hey Bill, so listen, I know you're jammed for time. You guys are getting ready to take off, but walk us through. Put us in the audience yesterday there with Secretary Pompeo. What was the reaction to the speech? I want to know. You've been doing this for 30 years. I'd like to hear your perspective of this kind of this amazing speech at the Nixon Library yesterday.
Yeah, Steve, this was I've been covering this issue for over 30 years, and this was the most important, significant speech by a senior U.S. leader since Nixon went to China back in the 70s. Very appropriate that they had this speech right up to the line calling for regime change in Beijing, but basically saying, look, we've got to change the Communist Party of China. Otherwise, there cannot be normal relations between the United States and the free world. He laid down a marker like I hadn't seen in decades, and I think it's extremely significant that we're moving forward with really putting ultimate pressure on what the military calls the center of gravity for the Cold War with China, which is the Communist Party of China.
Bill, you say, I want to go back to that term, regime change. What I found most powerful about this is that he was talking to of all the audiences, his primary audience to me seemed like not policymakers in Washington, not the guys on Wall Street, not their cheerleaders and their lobbyists and the people who have kept them in power, their business partners, and not even the American people. The American people were a significant audience. The most important audience he was talking to was the Chinese people. He essentially told the Chinese people, hey, we're here as your partners. Things have got to change, and the only way real change is going to come about is not just this alliance of democracy, but it's in the Chinese people's hands to actually make the changes that he talked about. It was really, he didn't, which I thought was brilliant. He didn't call for regime change like the U.S. government would not call for that. He called for the Chinese people to have regime change, and the rest of the world would be there for him. Is that your take?
Yeah, I think that's key. I think the strategy, he basically laid out the strategy, which is following on the Soviet model of perestroika and glasnost. Get some transparency, get some real information, get the Chinese people speaking, and they'll get rid of the Communist Party, which is universally hated within China. And I think he ended his speech by saying, God bless America, God bless the Chinese people. So he was clearly speaking abroad. Another key factor he talked about there was he said the current Chinese leadership does not speak with one voice. That was a clear recognition that there are fissures within the ruling Communist Party of China. And he was saying our new strategy is, look, we're going to reach out to the Chinese people. We're going to demand transparency. We're going to get information there. We're going to get reciprocity. So I think it's a very good strategy. Let's hope that they follow through with it with some real action. I think the closing of this consulate in Houston was important. Like you said, where's Mnuchin? Let's get the Treasury Secretary on board with this new strategy.
Look, I want to go back to that before we lose you, but he talked about at the beginning, set it up about this was the fourth of the speeches that he had worked with O'Brien and Ray and Barr to go through the different aspects of it. He actually said Barr's was the economic speech. Where's the hammer we have? The biggest hammer we have is our capital markets, our ability to finance the U.S. dollar, everything that comes from the financial superpower that we are. Where is the Secretary of Treasury, Bill? And what do you think Mnuchin has to do now when we've got a clearly laid out coherent strategy about taking these guys on, do you think this is going to a forcing function? This speech is a forcing function to force Mnuchin to start to step up here and take the actions that the Treasury Department clearly has to take and has to break off from their Wall Street cronies?
Well, the word I hear from inside the administration is that Mnuchin has been slow-rolling a lot of the major financial actions that have been taken. That said, the Trump administration has done some amazing things, sanctioning foreign Chinese officials for human rights violations. I think they need to do it in a much more comprehensive way, and again, that's going to require getting Mnuchin more on board. The way it shakes down is that the debate is still underway within certain factions of the Trump administration that, like Mnuchin, who would prefer to see go back to the old unfettered engagement, economic engagement with China, and hope that is going to change it. I think Pompeo was absolutely clear yesterday. Engagement has failed. It was based on a false hope that this idea of trading and conciliatory policies was going to change the system over there, and it's time for the new approach. And I think, as you said, we got to get the Treasury Department on board. I think Wilbur Ross has been successful at commerce. He's very strong on China, but again, Treasury has a lot more hammers that it can use against the CCP.
Last, I thought Hugh Hewitt did particularly a good job on the Q&A. I know Hugh's the president of the Nixon Library. It was I thought, a very bold move to invite Pompeo out to give the speech in the kind of the 50th year anniversary of Kissinger's secret trip, and in 2 years will be the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's historic trip. What was it like being there at the Nixon Library when you really have a speech by Secretary of State that is a kind of counter, because Nixon opened up China. Now, he brought the points about change, that China has to change. He had that magnificent quote of President Nixon's about, we may have created a Frankenstein. But what was the sense of the audience out there who I knew are some of the biggest donors and biggest supporters of the legacy of Richard Nixon?
It was very, 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 very supportive. On several occasions, there were universal applause from the audience, and there were probably about 150, 200 people there. Again, everybody was spread out, but I thought that it was well received. Again, it was very poignant that at the beginning of the engagement policy was Nixon, and now Pompeo's announcing the end of engagement at the same location.
嗱，班農曾經做過特朗普嘅總策略師，咁佢呢個電視台就基本上係親共和黨嘅，但係親中滅共係佢哋向來嘅更重要嘅主線，所以喺呢條主線之下，佢哋都轉播咗民主黨人 Mark Warner 對龐貝奧演講嘅點評。咁呢個人係乜水呢？以下5分鐘影片嘅下半節都有介紹㗎啦。另外有啲得意嘅就係民主黨人總要講衰特朗普，而主持人後來又為特朗普辯解，而且仲係遞翻支持民主黨嘅 CNN 轉頭。
I want to bring in another guest of sorts now, although not live on the show. But this range of clips that we have from Mark Warner, Democrat Mark Warner, is absolutely extraordinary. And I just thought, given the last two segments about the CCP and all this, we've got to show you guys how this isn't just a single party issue. This isn't just confined to the lunatics down here in the war room or to President Trump and his team. This is bigger and beyond that. You saw that yesterday, what we talked about with Mike Pompeo going across and solidifying, putting into place this alliance of liberty around the world and gathering together people from all around the world to see down the CCP here. It's also happening in terms of crossing party lines. So let's hear from a Democrat on this. Let's roll these tapes.
But I can tell you, for the last 2 years, I and other members of the Intel Committee have been holding classified briefings with business leaders and academic leaders about the concerted efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to steal our intellectual property, to steal it from companies, to steal it from universities, to be on better guard and greater guard. The fact that many of the Chinese tech companies are in effect arms of the Chinese state. And I think, without getting into the specifics, I think the FBI action is appropriate. And I think companies need to acknowledge that doing business with a lot of these Chinese firms, do it at your own risk, and the idea that they're going to sacrifice our values and principles to try to get access to the Chinese market is going to come back and bite them. Let me be clear. My concern is not with China, not with Chinese, obviously not, and one of the things that this president always mistakes is, making inappropriate comments about Chinese Americans. My problem is with the Communist Party of China, President Xi Jinping, and their effort to turn their business entities into agents of the state, their ability to create a surveillance state with technology, that what they've done to the Uyghurs in China, what they're trying to do now to the people of Hong Kong, and the fact that they use students as agents, they use companies as agents, and I know there will be some reaction from China, but this is in our national security interest, and more American businesses and universities need to acknowledge, recognize, and guard against this problem.
Senator, is there anything TikTok could do to make you feel better about having that app on the phones of American citizens?
Chuck, my daughters are a little bit older than I think your kids, but I wouldn't want TikTok on any of my devices. And there is, TikTok is a component of ByteDance. There is some efforts from some of the American investors to try to separate the enterprises. I'm open to see how they want to do that separation, but if the basic intellectual capital and the basic programming is still potentially at the whim of Communist Party functionaries in China, I would be pretty nervous about what you do.
Now, Mark Warner is no low-level Democrat. Mark Warner he was the keynote address at the 2008 Democrat conference. He's a senator. He's been the governor of Virginia. He's been the vice chair of the Senate Democrat Caucus, the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. This is a senior member of the Democratic Party, and I get it. He has to throw meat to MSNBC. Oh, the president's insulted Chinese Americans. The president's never done that, but he's on MSNBC. He has to throw that out. But listen to the signal that's coming out of Mark Warner there. The signal is the CCP and all of its apparatus. I want to bring in Jack Posobiec and also Governor Greitens. Governor Greitens, what your reaction to what Senator Warner said there?
Well, first of all, it's a good thing, right? So one of the things that held the country together during the Cold War is that you had Republicans and Democrats, a lot of whom were veterans of World War II, who were willing to put the country first. And yeah, there was always going to be internal divisions, but we should be able to agree. There should be, we'd hope, a sensible wing of the Democratic Party which would recognize that the Chinese Communist Party actually represents a threat. And it's good to see a senior member of the Democratic Party coming out and saying this and being able to get on the same page.
Jack Posobiec and then Steve Bannon. And then Jack next.
Yeah, just throw out that there were a lot of Democrats, senior-level Democrats, who actually used to be quite good on China. Nancy Pelosi used to be someone who would go over there, who would talk about the victims of Tiananmen, who would talk about the human rights record. She would talk about Tibet, endlessly speak about Tibet. Hillary Clinton, when she was First Lady, famously went over there and talked about human rights and women's rights in China. So this used to be something that we, as a country, as the foremost leader of the free world.
既然講開美國朝野兩黨嘅政治，郭文貴呢一方面嘅論述我都好應該報導一下嘅。原來佢認為只要滅共嘅就係好貓，滅共滅得勢力啲就係衰貓。你聽下，聽日下晝4點鐘，龐比奧國務卿從歐洲飛返去美國喺尼克遜呢個總統圖書館演講絕對同琴日川普總統嘅唔一樣。我哋可以理解川普總統而家係一切以選舉為重要琴日嘅演講係實在係唔好到而家仲係未講出嚟，話佢係共產黨病毒但係琴日2小時之後 CNN 就播出嚟喎。你睇下 Nancy Pelosi 呢個女人真係唔簡單㗎，人哋 Nancy Pelosi 真係民主鬥士，太佩服啦！我覺得呢個美國呢個女人真係唔簡單，上咗電視不靈不冷就同你嚟啦。佢話呢個病毒係共產黨嘅錯，咩時間到咗美國，係佢哋將佢輸送到美國，殺咗我哋幾多人係嘛？殺咗我哋幾多人然後佢哋又唔同我哋合作但係呢，我哋 而家嘅病毒呢，川普總統話唔使戴口罩喎，係個感冒啫嘛嚇。到後來佢又話戴口罩，而家又話大家必須戴口罩。然後呢又話喺解決問題之前係好麻煩嘅。佢話而家我覺得呢個就係川普總統病毒，川普病毒 Trump virus。哇塞！你哋知道呢單嘢幾大啊？呢單嘢發生，琴日冚唪唥全世界眼都癱咗啊！你知道呢個 Nancy Pelosi 一講出呢句嘢之後，對全世界政治家嘅影響有幾大啊？戰友們，有幾大？一下子川普總統就俾人兜口兜面鋥咗兩錘啊，揼兩下啊！咁你諗下咩概念啊？但係你話人哋 Nancy Pelosi， 我話呢個女人真係犀利，太犀利啦嚇！所以話兄弟姊妹們，呢個就係美國嘅政治啦，就係呢個共產黨病毒已經成為佢利用嘅工具。但係我想話俾戰友聽嘅嘢，所有人到而家連 Nancy Pelosi 都冇話係 CCP 病毒，佢都係講成係川普病毒啊！戰友們，咁係咩概念啊？戰友們，我話你知，川普總統都好，美國政客都好，第一考量係國內選舉啊，同時先至講解決病毒。呢個就係美國呢個所謂嘅民主政治帶嚟嘅巨大嘅麻煩。但係你唔好唔記得前兩日司法部長嗰個講話亦即係而家嘅5個幹將7大反共猛烈人士呢啲人唔係同你講玩噶，係嚟真噶我有啲嘢我喺呢度真係唔可以講，但係我可以話你知，美國而家全國上下邊個想停止滅共，咁你就係美國嘅敵人，絕對唔可能噶。跟住我係稍稍提一提一場爭吵，本來淨係叫你去睇注3都得嘅，不過注3裏面會叫你去睇粵語國文貴61B， 而且如果你時間唔多就叫你喺裏邊跳下睇幾個片段。咁我為咗方便你就做咗2件事，第一就係將粵語國文貴61B 放咗喺呢一輯嘅最後幾秒左上角，你一 click 就去得到噶啦。第二，如果你時間唔多就唔使你跳下揀嚟睇，我直接剪貼咗喺呢度，你跟住睇就得噶啦。如果你唔知道呢場爭吵係乜或者冇興趣，咁就可以直接跳4分鐘去附錄聽龐貝奧嘅演講，跟住就係呢4分鐘啦，係關於爭吵嘅文化理論嚟嘅。粵語國文貴61B 呢一輯報導性一半，思想性評論性一半。思想性方面可以話係58C 嘅續集。嗰一輯我哋講過呢度嘅紅色字54精神，亦即係點樣以多元同埋制衡改造專制極權嘅中國。呢一輯我哋會對呢個問題再深入啲探討，睇下新中國聯邦可能嘅文化究竟係同而不和嘅小人國，定係和而不同嘅君子國呢？呢一輯嘅第2部分我哋正係探討呢個問題。自由女神我認為代表住一種和而不同嘅政治文化。等我哋畫個表探討一下嗱，自由就係做法可以唔同，諗法可以唔同，而無需互相廝殺嘅，咁咪和而不同咯，即係多元。佢嘅相反就係同而不和，因為我正確你錯誤咯，咁所以你做嘢梗係要正確啦，所以打都要打到你同我一樣為止咯。譬如你拜錯咗神，夏寶龍、駱惠寧咪要拆你十字架，冚你啲家庭教會咯。係啦，總之中國人做親嘢都唔啱啦，鬼佬啱晒啦，得未啊？咁又唔係喎，鬼佬都好戇居嘅，人哋拜唔同嘅神就要去殺人嘅咯，而且執迷不悟200年。十字軍東征打咗幾多代人啊？等於道光咸豐嗰陣時打到而家啊！所以一味主義同多元制衡唔係中國人同鬼佬嘅分別，而係古代文明同現代價值嘅分別。只不過歐洲人早我哋300幾年，即係喺400幾年前，我哋嘅明朝中葉離開古代，慢慢進入現代。我哋100年前到都企圖進入現代文化㗎。嗰個就係5·4運動咯，但係呢100年來，我哋反反覆覆，而家仲戇居到以中華文明古國嘅偉大復興為榮添。咁你香港講咩現代普世價值，同我哋唔同，我哋以銅為貴，當然就要同你立國安法啦。但係呢啲你用專制極權指定點先至係正確，就算壓服到人都只會同而不和，不斷鬥爭。 所以若要長治久安，就必須弘揚54嘅現代價值，和而不同。正所謂君子和而不同，小人同而不和。雖然講呢句說話嘅人自己都做唔到，我哋又不必以人廢言，都係可以用呢個現代價值嚟檢視一下新中國聯邦嘅支持者同發起人有冇和而不同嘅胸襟呢？慶祝新中國聯邦成立嗰日嘅18小時直播，訪問咗不下20幾人。喺呢個喜慶嘅日子，唔會一味善頌善禱，而係講出同容納多元嘅意見。其中比較突出嘅就係唯一嘅香港受訪人勁港女 Mary Wong 啦。喺香港人支唔支持郭文貴同埋會唔會移民，佢平平實實咁表現出唔使乜都講正確唔正確呢種現代價值。
我平時周圍也有很多人，香港人對爆料革命的事情還是半信半疑。
好多分歧其實係冇所謂嘅，兄弟爬山各自努力，不分化不割席不篤灰啊嘛。和而不同唔止係現代價值，仲係力量嘅泉源啊！
團結更多的戰友啊，少樹敵，多做事，多行動。
到我總結兩句：小樹敵就係深黃接納淺黃嘅不同，淺黃接納深黃嘅不同。和而不同就係各自欣賞對方能夠團結到佢嗰橛光譜嘅群眾，無需將嗰啲不同下下上綱上線到係原則問題，砌低你先可以砌低共產黨，咁共產黨就最開心啦。你睇下佢哋出嗰啲視頻啦，大量都係執住黃絲內部一點半點嘅不同，然後大做文章係咁撩係咁撩，只係反映咗佢哋落後嘅古代價值，以為不同就一定不和噶啦。跟住就講咗好耐嘅附錄啦。假如你已經聽過，或者而家冇25分鐘去聽，咁我哋就喺呢度講再會啦。拜拜。
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Governor, for that very, very generous introduction. It is true, when you walk in that gym and you say the name Pompeo, there is a whisper. I had a brother, Mark, who was really good. A really good basketball player. And how about another round of applause for the Blue Eagles Honor Guard and Senior Airman Kayla Highsmith and her wonderful rendition of the national anthem. Thank you, too, to Pastor Lori for that moving prayer. And I want to thank Hugh Hewitt and the Nixon Foundation for your invitation to speak at this important American institution. It's great to be sung to by an Air Force person, introduced by a Marine, and they let the Army guy in front of the Navy guy's house. It's all good. It's an honor to be here in Yorba Linda, where Nixon's father built the house in which he was born and raised. To all the Nixon Center board and staff who made today possible. It's difficult in these times. Thanks for making this day possible for me and for my team. We are blessed to have some incredibly special people in the audience, including Chris, who I've gotten to know, Chris Nixon. I also want to thank Tricia Nixon and Julie Nixon Eisenhower for their support of this visit as well. I want to recognize several courageous Chinese dissidents who have joined us here today and made a long trip. And to all the other distinguished guests, To all the other distinguished guests, thank you for being here. For those of you who got under the tent, you must have paid extra. And those of you watching live, thank you for tuning in. And finally, as the governor mentioned, I was born here in Santa, not very far from here. I've got my sister and her husband in the audience today. Thank you all for coming out. I bet you never thought that I'd be standing up here. My remarks today are the fourth set of remarks in a series of China speeches that I asked National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, FBI Director Chris Wray, and the Attorney General Barr to deliver alongside me. We had a very clear purpose, a real mission, was to explain the different facets of America's relationship with China. The massive imbalances in that relationship that have built up over decades, and the Chinese Communist Party's designs for hegemony. Our goal was to make clear that the threats to Americans that President Trump's China policy aims to address are clear, and our strategy for securing those freedoms established. You know, Ambassador O'Brien spoke about ideology. FBI Director Wray talked about espionage. Attorney General Barr spoke about economics. And now my goal today is to put it all together for the American people and detail what the China threat means for our economy, for our liberty, and indeed for the future of free democracies around the world. Next year marks half a century since Dr. Kissinger's secret mission to China, and the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's trip isn't too far away in 2022. You know, the world was much different then. We imagined engagement with China would produce a future with bright promise of comedy and cooperation. But today we're all still wearing masks and watching the pandemic's body count rise because the CCP failed in its promises to the world. We're reading every morning new headlines of repression in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang. We're seeing staggering statistics of Chinese trade abuses that cost American jobs and strike enormous blows to the economies all across America, including here in Southern California. And we're watching a Chinese military that grows stronger and stronger and indeed more menacing. I'll echo the questions ringing in the hearts and minds of Americans from here in California to my home state of Kansas and beyond. What do the American people have to show now, 50 years on, from engagement with China? Did the theories of our leaders that proposed Chinese evolution towards freedom and democracy prove to be true? Is this China's definition of a win-win situation? And indeed, centrally, from Secretary of State's perspective, is America safer? Do we have a greater likelihood of peace for ourselves and peace for the generations which will follow us? Look, we have to admit a hard truth. We must admit a hard truth that should guide us in the years and decades to come. That if we want to have a free 21st century and not the Chinese century of which Xi Jinping dreams, the old paradigm of blind engagement with China simply won't get it done. We must not continue it, and we must not return to it. As President Trump has made very clear, we need a strategy that protects the American economy and indeed our way of life. The free world must triumph over this new tyranny. Now, before I seem too eager to tear down President Nixon's legacy, I want to be clear that he did what he believed was best for the American people at the time, and he may well have been right. He was a brilliant student of China, a fierce Cold Warrior, and a tremendous admirer of the Chinese people, just as I think we all are. He deserves enormous credit for realizing that China was too important to be ignored, even when the nation was weakened because of its own self-inflicted communist brutality. In 1967, in a very famous foreign affairs article, Nixon explained his future strategy. Here's what he said. He said, taking the long view, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside of the family of nations. The world cannot be safe until China changes. Thus, our aim, to the extent we can, we must influence events. Our goal should be to induce change. And I think that's the key phrase from the entire article, to induce change. So with that historic trip to Beijing, President Nixon kicked off our engagement strategy. He nobly sought a freer and safer world, and he hoped that the Chinese Communist Party would return that commitment. As time went on, American policymakers increasingly presumed that as China became more prosperous, it would open up, it would become freer at home, and indeed present less of a threat abroad. It'd be friendlier. It all seemed, I am sure, so inevitable. But that age of inevitability is over. The kind of engagement we've been pursuing has not brought the kind of change inside of China that President Nixon had hoped to induce. The truth is that our policies and those of other free nations resurrected China's failing economy only to see Beijing bite the international hands that were feeding it. We opened our arms to Chinese citizens only to see the Chinese Communist Party exploit our free and open society. China sent propagandists into our press conferences, our research centers, our high schools, our colleges, and even into our PTA meetings. We marginalized our friends in Taiwan, which later blossomed into a vigorous democracy. We gave the Chinese Communist Party and the regime itself special economic treatment, only to see the CCP insist on silence over its human rights abuses as the price of admission for Western companies entering China. Ambassador O'Brien ticked off a few examples just the other day. Marriott, American Airlines, Delta, United all removed references to Taiwan from their corporate websites so as not to anger Beijing. And Hollywood, not too far from here, the epicenter of American creative freedom and self-appointed arbiters of social justice, self-censors even the most mildly unfavorable reference to China. This corporate acquiescence to the CCP happens all over the world too. And how has this corporate fealty worked? Is its flattery rewarded? I'll give you a quote from the speech that General Barr gave, Attorney General Barr. In a speech last week, he said that the ultimate ambition of China's rulers isn't to trade with the United States, it is to raid the United States. China ripped off our prized intellectual property and trade secrets, causing millions of jobs all across America. It sucked supply chains away from America and then added a widget made of slave labor. It made the world's key waterways less safe for international commerce. President Nixon once said he feared he had created a Frankenstein by opening the world to the CCP. And here we are. Now, people of good faith can debate why free nations allowed these bad things to happen for all these years. Perhaps we were naive about China's virulent strain of communism, or triumphalist after our victory in the Cold War, or cravenly capitalist, or hoodwinked by Beijing's talk of a peaceful rise. Whatever the reason, today China is increasingly authoritarian at home and more aggressive in its hostility to freedom everywhere else. And President Trump has said enough. I don't think many people on either side of the aisle dispute the facts that I've laid out today. But even now, some are insisting that we preserve the model of dialogue for dialogue's sake. Now, to be clear, we'll keep on talking, but the conversations are different these days. I traveled to Honolulu now just a few weeks back to meet with Yang Jisheng. It was the same old story. Plenty of words, but literally no offer to change any of the behaviors. Yang's promises, like so many the CCP made before him, were empty. His expectations, I surmise, were that I'd cave to their demands, because frankly, this is what too many prior administrations have done. I didn't, and President Trump will not either. As Ambassador O'Brien explained so well, we have to keep in mind that the CCP regime is a Marxist-Leninist regime. General Secretary Xi Jinping is a true believer in a bankrupt totalitarian ideology. It's this ideology that informs his decades-long desire for global hegemony of Chinese communism. America can no longer ignore the fundamental political and ideological differences between our countries, just as the CCP has never ignored them. My experience in the House Intelligence Committee, and then as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and my now 2+ years as America's Secretary of State have led me to this central understanding that the only way to truly change communist China is to act not on the basis of what Chinese leaders say, but how they behave. And you can see American policy responding to this conclusion. President Reagan said that he dealt with the Soviet Union on the basis of trust but verify. When it comes to the CCP, I say we must distrust and verify. We the freedom-loving nations of the world must induce China to change, just as President Nixon wanted. We must induce China to change in more creative and assertive ways because Beijing's actions threaten our people and our prosperity. We must start by changing how our people and our partners perceive the Chinese Communist Party. We have to tell the truth. We can't treat this incarnation of China as a normal country just like any other. We know that trading with China is not like trading with a normal law-abiding nation. Beijing threatens international agreements treats international agreements as suggestions, as conduits for global dominance. But by insisting on fair terms, as our trade representative did when he secured our Phase 1 trade deal, we can force China to reckon with its intellectual property theft and policies that have harmed American workers. We know, too, that doing business with a CCP-backed company is not the same as doing business with, say, a Canadian company. They don't answer to independent boards. And many of them are state-sponsored and so have no need to pursue profits. A good example is Huawei. We stopped pretending Huawei is an innocent telecommunications company just showing up to make sure you can talk to your friends. We've called it what it is, a true national security threat, and we've taken action accordingly. We know, too, that if our companies invest in China, they may wittingly or unwittingly support the Communist Party's gross human rights violations. Our Departments of Treasury and Commerce have thus sanctioned blacklisted Chinese leaders and entities that are harming and abusing the most basic rights for people all across the world. Several agencies have worked together on a business advisor to make certain that our CEOs are informed of how their supply chains are behaving inside of China. We know too that not all Chinese students and employees are just normal students and workers that are coming here to make a little bit of money and to garner themselves some knowledge. Too many of them come here to steal our intellectual property and to take this back to their country. The Department of Justice and other agencies have vigorously pursued punishment for these crimes. We know that the People's Liberation Army is not a normal army too. Its purpose is to uphold the absolute rule of the Chinese Communist Party elites and expand a Chinese empire, not to protect the Chinese people. And so our Department of Defense has ramped up its efforts, freedom of navigation operations out throughout the East and South China Seas and in the Taiwan Strait as well. And we've created a space force to help deter China from aggression on that final frontier. And so too, frankly, we've built out a new set of policies at the State Department dealing with China, pushing President Trump's goals for fairness and reciprocity to rewrite the imbalances that have grown over decades. Just this week, we announced the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston because it was a hub of spying and intellectual property theft. We reversed 2 weeks ago 8 years of cheek turning with respect to international law in the South China Sea. We've called on China to conform its nuclear capabilities to the strategic realities of our time. And the State Department at every level, all across the world, has engaged with our Chinese counterparts simply to demand fairness and reciprocity. But our approach can't just be about getting tough. That's unlikely to achieve the outcome that we desire. We must also engage and empower the Chinese people, a dynamic, freedom-loving people who are completely distinct from the Chinese Communist Party. That begins with in-person diplomacy. I've met Chinese men and women of great talent and diligence wherever I go. I've met with Uyghurs and ethnic Kazakhs who have escaped Xinjiang's concentration camps. I've talked with Hong Kong's democracy leaders, from Cardinal Zen to Jimmy Lai. 2 days ago in London, I met with Hong Kong freedom fighter Nathan Law. And last month, in my office, I heard the stories of Tiananmen Square survivors. One of them's here today. Wang Dan was a key student who has never stopped fighting for freedom for the Chinese people. Mr. Wang, will you please stand so that we may recognize you? Also with us today is the father of the Chinese democracy movement, Wei Jinsheng. He spent decades in Chinese labor camps for his advocacy. Mr. Wei, will you please stand? You know, I grew up and served my time in the Army during the Cold War, and if there's one thing I learned, communists almost always lie. The biggest lie that they tell is to think that they speak for 1.4 billion people who are surveilled, oppressed, and scared to speak out. Quite the contrary, the CCP fears the Chinese people's honest opinions more than any foe. And save for losing their own grip on power, they have no reason to. Just think how much better off the world would be, not to mention the people inside of China, if we had been able to hear from the doctors in Wuhan and they'd been allowed to raise the alarm about the outbreak of a new and novel virus. For too many decades, our leaders have ignored, downplayed the words of brave Chinese dissidents and warned us about the nature of the regime we're facing, and we can't ignore it any longer. They know as well as anyone that we can never go back to the status quo. But changing the CCP's behavior cannot be the mission of the Chinese people, and free nations have to work to defend freedom. It's the furthest thing from easy. But I have faith we can do it. I have faith because we've done it before. We know how this goes. I have faith because the CCP is repeating some of the same mistakes that the Soviet Union made. Alienating potential allies, breaking trust at home and abroad, rejecting property rights and predictable rule of law. I have faith. I have faith because of the awakening I see among other nations that know we can't go back to the past in the same way that we do here in America. I've heard this from Brussels to Sydney to Hanoi. And most of all, I have faith we can defend freedom because of the sweet appeal of freedom itself. Look at the Hong Kongers clamoring to emigrate abroad as the CCP tightens its grip on that proud city. They wave American flags. It's true. There are differences. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is deeply integrated into the global economy. But Beijing is more dependent on us than we are on them. Look, I reject the notion that we're living in an age of inevitability, that some trap is preordained, that CCP supremacy is the future. Our approach isn't destined to fail because America is in decline. As I said in Munich earlier this year, the free world is still winning. We just need to believe it and know it and be proud of it. People from all over the world still want to come to open societies. They come here to study. They come here to work. They come here to build a life for their families. They're not desperate to settle in China. It's time. It's great to be here today. The timing is perfect. It's time for free nations to act. Not every nation will approach China in the same way, nor should they. Every nation will have to come to its own understanding of how to protect its own sovereignty, how to protect its own economic prosperity, and how to protect its ideals from the tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party. But I call on every leader of every nation to start by doing what America has done, to simply insist on reciprocity, to insist on transparency and accountability from the Chinese Communist Party. It's a cadre of rulers that are far from homogenous, and these simple and powerful standards will achieve a great deal. For too long, we let the CCP set the terms of engagement, but no longer. Free nations must set the tone. We must operate on the same principles. We have to draw common lines in the sand that cannot be washed away by the CCP's bargains or their blandishments. Indeed, this is what the United States did recently when we rejected China's unlawful claims in the South China Sea once and for all, as we have urged countries to become clean countries so that their citizens' private information doesn't end up in the hand of the Chinese Communist Party. We did it by setting standards. Now, it's true, it's difficult. It's difficult for some small countries. They fear being picked off. Some of them, for that reason, simply don't have the ability or the courage to stand with us for the moment. Indeed, we have a NATO ally of ours that hasn't stood up in the way that it needs to with respect to Hong Kong because they fear Beijing will restrict access to China's market. This is the kind of timidity that will lead to historic failure, and we can't repeat it. We cannot repeat the mistakes of these past years. The challenge of China demands exertion, energy from democracies, those in Europe, those in Africa, those in South America, and especially those in the Indo-Pacific region. And if we don't act now, ultimately, the CCP will erode our freedoms and subvert the rules-based order that our societies have worked so hard to build. If we bend the knee now, our children's children may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party, whose actions are the primary challenge today in the free world. General Secretary Xi is not destined to tyrannize inside and outside of China forever unless we allow it. Now, this isn't about containment. Don't buy that. It's about a complex new challenge that we've never faced before. The USSR was closed off from the free world. Communist China is already within our borders. So we can't face this challenge alone. The United Nations, NATO, the G7 countries, the G20, our combined economic, diplomatic, and military power is surely enough to meet this challenge if we direct it clearly and with great courage. Maybe it's time for a new grouping of like-minded nations, a new alliance of democracies, We have the tools. I know we can do it. Now we need the will. To quote scripture, I ask, is our spirit willing, but our flesh weak? If the free world doesn't change, communist China will surely change us. There can't be a return to the past practices because they're comfortable or because they're convenient. Securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time, and America is perfectly positioned to lead it because our founding principles give us that opportunity. As I explained in Philadelphia last week, staring at Independence Hall, our nation was founded on the premise that all human beings possess certain rights that are unalienable, and it's our government's job to secure those rights. It is a simple and powerful truth. It's made us a beacon of freedom for people all around the world, including people inside of China. Indeed, Richard Nixon was right when he wrote in 1967 that the world cannot be safe until China changes. Now it's up to us to heed his words. Today, the danger is clear, and today the awakening is happening. Today, the free world must respond. We can never go back to the past. May God bless each of you. May God bless the Chinese people. And may God bless the people of the United States of America. Thank you all.
以上字幕係新唐人電視台製作嘅，我當然要感謝啦。一如以往，請你補看、點讚、留言、廣傳、訂閱同埋參考，最後係閱讀個雜誌。多謝。仲有，如果你仲有半小時，就請你 click 左上角睇粵語國文貴61B 啦。